Crane was born in Dublin around 1817. His father was a wheelwright. When he was arrested in 1832, he was a chairmaker's boy, so we assume he had some sort of income. Peter, our Dubliner, could neither read nor write, although his older brother Patrick, a tallow chandler, who arrived in Sydney in 1837 wearing the same uniform, transported on ship Heber, could do both. Peter may have been arrested twice, the first time in 1832 for stealing a shawl from a carriage. The Irish prison registers from 1790 till 1924 list him as imprisoned in Kilmainham Jail. His ship indent of 1834 says, "Picks pockets." Although every surname that ever existed in Ireland could be found in Dublin in the 19th century, most of the Gaelic and Norman names could be traced to the provinces. Crane sounds English, but evidence proved that Peter's name was really Crean. This name could be traced back to the 8th century in Donegal. The O'Creans were part of the penal Moan, the chiefs being the O'Gormleys, a sept that were loyal to the Northern O'Neills, certainly by the 12th century. In Donegal, the Kinalmoan inhabited the Inishowen and Raphoe areas where once stood a ring fort, the Grianorn of Ailech, the centre of an ancient Gaelic kingdom. This magnificent ring fort had views over both Loch Swilly and Loch Foyle in the north of Ireland. Built in the 6th century, this significant edifice was used till the 11th century, when destroyed, and the O'Neills and their Kinalowen were pushed further south and east by 1283 into areas like Tyrone, by the O'Donnells and their Kinal-Connell. By the 13th century, some of the O'Creans had moved into the Ardstraw area around Strabane, in Tyrone, O'Neill country. Perhaps they were once O'Donnell people. The 1852 baptismal certificate of Peter's first child, Catherine, is a good example of where to find the Irish version of an anglicised surname, such as Crean, for an Irish priest would hopefully spell the name correctly. This is the wild north country of County Donegal. The cattle routes went from Derry through Strabane and down to Sligo. Perhaps the O'Creans, who were tanners and merchants, decided this would be a good place to set up business. By the 12th century, the O'Creen families had moved into the town of Sligo, until the Anglo-Norman William Fitzgerald built a fort there. It was a scattering of fisher people. Ideally located by the sea and near a river mouth, Sligo was surrounded by a fertile hinterland and fisheries. The town became a main trading port in Ireland. By the 16th century, the O'Creans, who had stayed in Sligo, had become merchant princes and prominent clergymen. However, some had been forced to leave due to Cromwellian confiscations and other property forfeitures, some of whom were found in Dublin. In 1712, either on the way to Dublin or on returning to Sligo, a Stephen Crane and Company were implicated in hearing Mass in the very north of the county of Kildare. It seems that Peter was released from jail after several months in 1832 for stealing a shawl. His magistrate or judge was Count Blacken, quite well known at the time, but he must have been arrested again later for pickpocketing, and his case was heard at the Four Courts and eventually was transported from Dublin to Sydney on the transport ship James Lane. We know for sure that the Cranes lived or worked around Watling Street somewhere, because many years later in Australia, his brother had to sign an affidavit saying that he knew Andrew Glannon, who had disappeared in New South Wales, who had lived in that area of Dublin. This picture has been taken from a recent book called Floating Prisons by Anne McMahon, who has researched thoroughly the prison hulks that were in the harbours of Cork and Dublin. The James Lane took 133 days to reach Sydney from Dublin, leaving in February and arriving in June 1834. It was a very old bark built in 1818. Only 4 of the 200 men embarked died on the journey, but there was much sickness and fever, and the conditions were so horrid that the young surgeon took his own life before reaching Sydney. Peter was probably taken straight away out to Cabramatta to Belfield Farm, where he was assigned to Robert Bell, a convict supervisor. He possibly lived in this lockup underneath the homestead, which is still there. There were many other homesteads about where he may have laboured. Peter received his certificate of freedom in January 1841. However, he wasn't out of trouble yet. How did our dispossessed ancestors treat the dispossessed people of their new home? By 1843, Peter was back in jail. After a hearing at Camden Courthouse, jail in Parramatta and Darlinghurst, he was exonerated from the crimes of burglary and assault at the Sydney Supreme Court. This little scare may have fuelled his decision to head north to the Hunter Valley, where he worked for Ogilvie, Surveyor General at the time, on his Merton station. Perhaps Ogilvie suggested that he get himself up to the newly gazetted town of Wellington and grab a bit of land. And he did. Peter built the first house in Wellington. One day, when he was shopping in either Sydney or Bathurst, he met young Mary Cassidy from Derry, whom he married in this little wooden church, St Michael's at Kelso. He had already built a small slab cottage, something like this one. I wonder if Peter looked like this when he was young. Peter became what was called a rough builder. You see his name in the newspapers regarding buildings in the Wellington area. He and Mary had a large brood of children, and this little house is the last house he built in Swift Street, Wellington. Peter and Mary are my great-great-grandparents. Considering the difficult times they came from, they did very well in looking after themselves and their children, taking part in these building projects like the church here in Wellington.